Good evening. So, I don't think this is on yet, but I'll keep saying good evening. I don't typically do this, but a lot of my mentors, when they say good evening and they don't get a response, they encourage us to all try again. So while we wait for the AV to sort itself out, I'll say good evening. Good evening. Great, thank you. Here we go. Great. Thank you for indulging that exercise, but now we've all said good evening to one another, which is terrific. I am Beth Manchester, the Senior Associate Director for the Eric H. Holder Jr. Initiative for Civil and Political Rights. And I am delighted to welcome you to this evening's American Voter Project discussion panel and on the upcoming election. On behalf of both the Holder Initiative and Columbia College, I would like to share how thrilled we are to welcome three luminaries of justice who all happen to be Columbia College alumni. First, I'd like to welcome back Attorney General Eric Holder, the namesake and champion of our initiative. General Holder is the chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee and is the third longest serving Attorney General in U.S. history and the first African American to hold that office. He is also an alumnus of not just one, but two schools here at Columbia, graduating from the college in 1973 and the law school in 1976. I'd also like to welcome back Michael Waldman, Columbia College class of 1982. He is the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. I have to turn my page. Thank you. A nonpartisan and policy institute that focuses on improving systems of democracy and justice. The Brennan Center is a leading national voice on voting rights, money and politics, criminal justice reform, and constitutional law. Mr. Waldman, who is a constitutional lawyer and writer, is an American expert on the presidency and American democracy. He has led the center since 2005. Michael was kind enough to join us for a talk on voting rights on Zoom during COVID, so we are particularly excited to be able to hear from him tonight in person. Thank you for joining us again, Michael. Last and certainly not least, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for this evening's talk, Mila Atmos. Mila is a wonderful friend of the Holder Initiatives and has been a staunch supporter since its inception in 2017. She is a graduate of both the college and the School of International Public Affairs, and is the host and executive producer of Future Hindsight, an award-winning pro-democracy podcast that aims to spark civic action and empower citizens, one more page, to make impact. What most informs Mila's worldview is her belief that citizen participation is fundamental to a thriving democracy. Mila combines life experiences from living in multiple cultures, ranging from Indonesia to Germany to the rural US, with her knowledge base in history, economics, and international affairs in creating Future Hindsight. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Mila. Thank you so much to our wonderful panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Beth. Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the American Voter Project at the Eric Holder Jr. Initiative for Political and Civil Rights. It's really exciting to be here. So, except for the esteemed guests on the stage here, most people ignore voting issues until just about right now. Very close to election time. And when I say voting issues, I don't mean who to vote for, but how voting happens. And it's actually super central to democracy. That word, democracy, can be such a contested, slippery kind of a word, but the act of voting, which is to say the infrastructure, the election workers, the counting, and the tallying of votes, that's what makes that word democracy into something muscular and tangible and truly ours. So that's what we are really here to talk about, the voting issues that both Eric Holder and Michael Waldman have dedicated their lives to working on and thinking about. We are 40 days out from the election, which is the last day that Americans can cast a vote. But the election, of course, is already underway with early voting in a lot of states and also being contested in some other ones. We are at the beginning of a long road, I fear. Thank you very much, both of you, Attorney General Holder and Michael Waldman, for joining us. So my first question is about something we're hearing over and over again, that democracy is on the ballot this year. And we've heard that, of course, in 2020. As well. So what does that mean to you? Maybe, Michael, you can go first, and then General Holder.
First of all, let me start by saying thank you for having me, and what a great privilege it is for me to be with Attorney General Holder. He was a great Attorney General But not just that, he has been an extraordinary public citizen before and since in this fight for democracy, and we're really grateful for your service. We are in a great fight for the future of American democracy right now. I really believe the stakes are that high. It's not only an important election. We always say, oh, this is the most important election in history, and sometimes it's true. But for the very first time in a long time, the very fact of having a democracy, a meaningful democracy where people's votes are cast and counted fairly, is contested and is one of the central issues and is going to also be one of the great question marks about what happens. The history of our country, of course, is a long struggle to make the ideal of American democracy real, to make sure that we expand who sits at the table, to make sure that the changing country is represented fully in the democratic system. There's been many ways in which we have not lived up to the ideals, all the racial discrimination, all the challenges for immigrants and women over and over. But I don't think we've had a moment like now where there is a large, mobilized political movement trying to undo the very premises of our democracy. The myths about non-citizen voting, that many non-citizens are voting, that you hear out there, that's the principal rumor that is out there in the land right now. That is not just something that seeps up from the dark reaches of the internet. That is a political strategy being pushed in this election. The big lie this year is being pre-deployed. And we are seeing unfolding in front of our eyes an effort to discredit the election before it happens. So to me, at the very least, that's part of why I think democracy is on the ballot. Are we going to have an election of the kind that we always thought was the essence of what it meant to have a meaningful democracy rooted in the rule of law?
Yeah, I would agree with what Michael said. I do think our democracy is on the ballot. I guess in some ways you could say it always is, because every presidential election is about what the nation's going to look like going forward. But I actually think that we have to look beyond the presidential election and do go down ballot. I hate that expression, this notion of down ballot elections, as if they are somehow less important. Because the reality is we have running not only at the presidential level, but at all levels that people around the country will be making decisions, people who are, I would say, not committed to that which are our founding ideals. You know, imperfect though they were in the formation and with the problems that we've had as a nation, during the course of our history, you talk about, I think you're right, there is a movement here that's, trying to undermine, discredit, do things to our notion of a democracy. But the thing that's interesting here, it's not a movement, it's a political party. We've always had whack jobs and, groups of people who've done that, but we've never had one of our two major political parties talk about non-citizens voting, casting about for all kinds of reasons why they didn't win an election that are not fact-based. There's some school of thought that says, Richard Nixon actually won the vote in 1960, but instead of contesting it after talking to Dwight Eisenhower, thought that it was better for the country to go forward with the election of John Kennedy. I don't know, true or not, but I mean, that at least that's a mindset that this iteration of the Republican Party could not even imagine. If they genuinely lose, they still think that they win. And I think this party, Republican Party, and this is pretty harsh. What I'm about to say, it's pretty harsh, but I think it's true. They've made peace with the notion that they are going to be potentially a minority party in terms of popular support that has majority power. They're like okay with that. This is all about the acquisition and retention of power. It's almost like a political, I call it a political apartheid system. They're okay with that. And that's what this choice that we are facing is really all about. Which path do we want to go down? One party, as I said, okay with power and for power's sake, whether it means something I've been trying to deal with, at the NDRC, at the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, gerrymandering, partisan and racial gerrymandering, voter suppression. These are all tactics that one of our two major political parties has engaged in order to hold on to power. And if we're going to take us out of what I think is a doom loop, it'll happen at the election that we're about to conduct. But not only at the presidential level, also at lower federal level, and also at the state and local level as well.
Yes.
This election, and we are now seeing some of the things in our constitutional and political system running up against this. Right. This is an empirical statement, not a partisan statement, but one political party has won the popular vote for the presidential election in 7 of the last 8 elections, and that is by far the longest winning streak for a political party in the United States in the popular vote. But the other party, for example, has appointed 6 of the 9 lifetime appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court. These are things that are deeply baked into our revered but old Constitution, and it makes it possible for a minority faction, in effect, to try to cling to power as the world changes around them.
Yeah, I mean, that, we're going to talk about it. I think, the Electoral College, that's a problem. The filibuster, that's a problem. I mean, all of these things that are designed potentially to protect minorities have actually ensured or made more possible minority rule. And the founders never thought that that was a good thing. They actually considered, whether or not you needed to have supermajorities to pass legislation. And after the experience that the nation had, the founders had with the Articles of Confederation, decided no, simple majorities will be the things that you need so that you can, in fact, move on, so that government can actually function.
Right. Yeah, well, so much has changed, and having majoritarian government clearly is not really in the cards anytime soon, I think. But let's talk about what has changed. So in 2020, Michael, this question is for you. There was really a feeling that among Democrats, Joe Biden just had to win. And then once he wins, it'll all just go back to normal. But it's really not back to normal, or maybe normal was not really a thing anyway. But all this to say, there's been a shift in how Americans view elections, and indeed how actually elections are done than 4 years ago, or even slightly longer than that. So, Michael, how would you describe what has changed?
I mean, I would say that it's not so unusual to have these core issues of our democracy and how it functions and what it means at the center of public debate. There are many other times in our history when that has been the case, and that itself doesn't bother me. Remember what happened in 2020. In March of 2020, the pandemic hit, and it looked for a while as if we were not really necessarily going to have free and fair elections in the United States. It was just too disruptive. All the poll workers weren't showing up, and primaries were getting canceled. And what happened in that moment of fear and chaos was actually quite inspiring. States began changing their procedures. The Brennan Center, which I lead, actually wrote the plan, which was embraced by the civil rights and voting rights groups, and states changed their systems to make it so people could vote during a pandemic. All the things that you're familiar with now: expanded early voting, universal access to vote by mail, safe polling places, in-person polling places, which turned out to be arenas and big box stores because they were big. It was not drop boxes. It was not partisan. Major American businesses mobilized 600,000 people to be poll workers that year, to step in for the more elderly people who usually do it. And so by Election Day, despite the pandemic, it was the highest voter turnout since 1900, and Donald Trump's own Department of Homeland Security said it was the most secure election in American history. And it was an extraordinary civic achievement. We thought everybody involved should get a medal. That wasn't the only reaction. As you know, what came immediately afterwards was the big lie, the idea that it had been stolen, that it had been rigged, which is now believed by tens of millions of people. The insurrection, driven by that same big lie, and then a wave of voter suppression laws across many states in the country, also driven by that false sense, that has continued to make it harder for people to vote. So what's different, what's not normal, what didn't recede into kind of normalcy was this energized, politicized, mobilized, highly organized and funded movement to kind of make it harder for people to exercise their democratic rights. And that's the situation we're facing right now.
Right.
See, I think that history is really important to remember. I mean, think about this. Again, in the middle of a pandemic, we had the highest turnout, since 1900. Huge numbers of Americans actually voted in a whole bunch of different ways. And Trump's own DHS said, Department of Homeland Security, said that it was fair, And the result was, in fact, legitimate. And that seems to have gotten just kind of brushed away, And as you said, there are tens of millions of people who think the election was stolen. There are probably tens of millions more who think, well, maybe something happened there that wasn't quite right. And there's no proof of that. In fact, we had an unbelievably fair election with a record number of people, so we probably had a better sense of who the American people wanted to be president out of that election than we've had since 1900, or something like that. And that's all gotten lost. That is all simply gotten lost.
Yeah, it's a shame that we don't talk about that more because the big lie has been so pervasive. But voter suppression has a very long history, of course. And in the modern times, I wonder if to understand what's really happening, we need to go back 11 years to Shelby County versus Holder, the case in which the Supreme Court invalidated an essential part of the Voting Rights Act. General Holder, is that when you would sort of carbon date the shift to?
Well, first off, we never call it the Shelby County versus Holder case. It's just the Shelby County case. I don't want my name ever associated with that abomination. It's almost like, be like Dred Scott versus Holder. I wouldn't want my name. No, I wouldn't like that. I think there's always bubbling within the United States a desire to, among groups, but not necessarily a political party, but among groups to kind of like, get more power than that which you are entitled to. The Shelby County case, which took away from the Justice Department the ability to pre-clear things that states wanted to do. I mean, all kinds of unnecessary voter ID laws, closing polling places, purging voters, the kind of things that the Justice Department probably would have said, no, you can't do that. Or actually, the states would not even have asked to do those kinds of things, knowing that the Justice Department would have said no. Those things then were put in place. So I think that in some ways, yes, Shelby County is a marker from which you can measure a lot of the problems that we are now dealing with. But if you look at the history of this country, there's always been this push and pull between those who are truly committed to democracy and those who try to kind of cut corners or cheat in order to have electoral success. I mean, the history of African Americans in this country and the ability, freed in 1865, don't really get to be full participants in our democracy until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's 100 years. Young people don't get the vote until there's an amendment to the Constitution. Women don't get the right to vote till the early 1900s. There's a whole bunch of things that were, put in place, or structures that needed to be erased before we got to the place where we needed to be. And then, it's not as if voter suppression was invented post-Shelby County. That has been going on, especially in the South, especially with regard to people of color, and in other parts of the country as well. But the Shelby County case was nevertheless unbelievably significant, and I think one of the worst Supreme Court decisions, of all time. I mean, I think, Dred Scott, Korematsu, Shelby County, the presidential immunity case, those are among those may be the worst four. I'd have to think about it, but that's certainly 4 of the top 5, 6, right there.
Yeah, those were all really bad. So, Michael, I wanted to ask you about some other methods to suppress and dilute voting, and I'm thinking here we might start with an explainer on some of the ways gerrymandering works, vote cracking and packing, and how a project like Red Map, which of course started a year before the Shelby County decision, how Red Map reshape voting?
So gerrymandering, it's quite interesting how many people know what it is now, which is really different from just a few years ago. Every 10 years, the census recounts the population of the United States. And when the census was put into the Constitution, that was considered a radically democratic thing, because we were going to actually count where people lived so that you could have, in those elected bodies that were voted on by the people, you would actually know where people were. Gerrymandering is the drawing of electoral district lines to benefit either a political party or a racial faction, or in some way that doesn't represent the actual votes of the people. And it's a big deal right now. Attorney General Holder is very involved in fighting against unfair gerrymandering in maps. The Brennan Center works on that as well. It's important to note, this wasn't invented last year, and it wasn't invented in 2010 or in recent years. In the very first congressional election, Patrick Henry drew a map to try to keep James Madison from getting elected to Congress. And they had not yet invented the word gerrymandering at the time. So this is not new, but it has gotten much worse because of digital technology. It used to be an art, it is now a science. And you can really draw these maps with significant precision to ensure that the voters really don't get a choice, that there's not competition, or that a racial group is disfavored despite the changes. What happened in 2010 was the Republicans happened to win the congressional midterm elections and happened to win the state legislatures, because it's the states that draw the congressional maps. And the issue was health care and the economy and other thing, but that was used by very effective partisan operatives to draw very, very effectively gerrymandered maps that lasted well into the decade. What we're seeing now is most of the population growth in the country comes in the South. Mostly it is communities of color, and those states are the most gerrymandered, and their legislatures are the least representative, so that it is compounding the disjunction between the way the country is moving and the way the political system is frozen. So there are all kinds of technical terms. Cracking is where you take African American voters, for example, and scatter them into different districts. Packing is you make sure everybody's in one district. These are tools that have been used forever by political operatives, but they're more potent now, and it's more important now to do something to stop it from happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think the power of gerrymandering, or the existence of gerrymandering, is now, I think, in people's consciousness, and that's solely as a result of the work that I've done at the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Just kidding. But I have two of my colleagues here. Come on, stand up. These folks here work with me at the NDRC. Here we are. But that was actually a problem for us when we started the NDRC in January of 2017. We had to raise people's consciousness to make people understand what the impact of gerrymandering was. You know, if a state has, let's say, a 60% black population, no state does, let's just say a 60% black population, you can draw the lines in such a way that that 60% does not get 60% of the people who go to the United States House of Representatives, or 60% of the people who go to state legislatures. You can put them together, that's packing them, or you can crack them in such a way that their power is diminished. I mean, one example in my book, Our Unfinished March, which you should all read, and it's going to be a test on it, so get it. Our Unfinished March, we talk about how at North Carolina A&T, which is the largest HBCU in the country, they drew a line right down the middle of that campus, so that the black kids who went to that school were in two different congressional districts, minimize their power. Put them together, and they are a pretty potent force. But if you draw that line right down the middle of campus, that puts their power roughly half of what it might otherwise be. A young woman named Love Caesar took a piece of chalk and one night drew a line right down the middle of campus where that line was drawn. People get up the next morning, what's this big chalk line? And she explained to everybody, you know, we're in two different districts. They got in touch with us. We sue, we win under with the North Carolina Supreme Court. And that racial gerrymander was undone. I mean, she talked about the fact that Freshman year, she was in one dorm and she was in one electoral district. Sophomore year, she moved to another dorm on the other side of the street, and she was in a different congressional district. So gerrymandering is such a negative thing, because if you're in a safe gerrymandered seat, you're guaranteed to win. You're guaranteed to win. So you're not worried about a general election. You're worried about a primary challenge. And if you're in the Republican Party, that pushes you further and further to the right, because you don't want to be challenged by a person in the primary. In a primary, and to be fair, pushes Democrats, I suppose, further and further to the left. But if you cooperate elected, if you cooperate with your, if you're Republican, with your Democratic, colleagues, that's seen as a sign of weakness and invites a primary challenge, and therefore nothing gets done. People don't reach across the aisle, as we say. Nothing gets done, which breeds cynicism in the American people, because they see a government that is, at all levels, it's unresponsive to the desires, the political desires, the policy desires of the American people. The Dobbs decision, I'm going on here, but I'll finish here. The Dobbs decision, I think, is a real good example shows the power of gerrymandering. Everywhere it's been polled, in every state, not one state or the people in one state have said we wanted Roe versus Wade overturned. Not one. Now, the margin's a little different, in Oklahoma as opposed to, say, New York State. But in spite of that, these folks in these gerrymandered seats have put in place these draconian anti-choice laws, inconsistent with the desires of their constituents, but don't face any electoral consequence because they're in these safe seats. And again, that's a very tangible example of the negative power that the gerrymandering has.
Thank you. So, General Holder, you actually get to give us some of the good news, or the less bad voting rights news, which is the Alabama case, Merrill versus Milligan. Can you explain how that case came about and what it achieved?
Yeah, another thing, a case brought by the NDRC in conjunction with some other folks that challenged what was going on with regard to the congressional districting that was done in Alabama. Alabama black citizens make up about 27% of the voting age population. They have about 7 congressmen, I think it's 7 congressmen. And so you would think that things naturally, and there's a history of racially polarized voting in Alabama and throughout much of the South. White folks vote for white candidates, black folks vote for black candidates, and like 95% of the time, something like that. And so you take that into account under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and you say, well, this community, African-American community, should have about 27% of the representatives, which means you should have 2 opportunity zones to elect a black congressman. In fact, for years, it had only been 1. So we bring a case, we sue. Remarkably, we win in front of this United States Supreme Court. Now, I'll admit, we had the facts on our side, we had the law on our side, we had precedent on our side. But I wasn't necessarily expecting to win with this Supreme Court. And I remember, I don't know, Issa, you, Sophia, somebody came up and said, hey, we won the case. And I was thinking, what? But we did. We nevertheless won the case, and there will be this November, for the first time, an election in Alabama where African Americans will have the opportunity to fully express themselves in the selection of who will represent them in Congress. It's personal for me. My wife is from Alabama. Her sister, Vivian Malone, was the young African American woman who integrated the University of Alabama when George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door. And so to have that as a victory that my organization, the NDRC, can claim, at least in part, was as a result of our work, is something that's really meaningful. But it's also had a collateral impact. And we now see the same thing happening in Louisiana, where there's going to be an African-American opportunity zone for the first time. Also, with regard, has a collateral impact as well in Georgia. But we're going to use that precedent in other parts of the South to give people of color the opportunity to be adequately represented. And I think in my own mind, Hispanics in Texas is something where I think we need to look at what we can do there.
And it's not only a story of success, but also shows how bipartisan or nonpartisan the fight against unfair gerrymandering can be, because of course both parties have done this over the years. In Ohio, the state Supreme Court struck down a gerrymandered congressional and legislative map 5 times. And 5 times.
Listen to that. Listen to that. State Supreme Court knocked it down 5 times.
5
Continue.
times. The legislature simply ignored what the court had done. And then the Chief Justice of the court, who was a prominent Republican in Ohio, had to retire as Chief Justice because her term ended, Justice Maureen O'Connor. And this very rock-ribbed Republican leader in Ohio said, what will I do with the rest of my life? I know I'll pass a ballot initiative to take the power of redistricting away from the politicians in the state legislature and have a nonpartisan independent election commission. And she has teamed up with the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, which is a people of color-led, progressive grassroots organization. It is the greatest buddy movie in American politics right now. They keep the powers that be in the state keep trying to stop it. They rewrote the language of the referendum to say this is a pro-gerrymandering referendum, but I think it's still going to pass. And it shows, especially in the states where you have direct democracy, that this is something that can mobilize people in a way that I don't think anybody ever really thought was possible. Often these things, people look under the hood, they think it's a political trick of some kind, but enough people now understand what's at stake in the challenges to our democracy that this kind of thing can happen.
Yeah. Well, talking about red states, blue states, this is, of course, a country or voting in a blue state is very different than voting in a red state, right? And thanks to the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, of course, voting rights are not universal. Can we talk about some of the tactics, Michael, being used in the states right now, like purging voter rolls? Earlier you said there was this myth of the non-citizen voting, which is simply not true. So it seems to me that these serve a dual purpose. One is to chill voting, people don't want to vote, but also to confuse voters.
You're exactly right. There are many things going on. There are attempts to purge hundreds of thousands of voters from the voter rolls. These are mostly failing because it's illegal, and election officials who are working really hard are stopping it. You have all different kinds of laws and tactics, and it's important to note, as we think about the Shelby County case, the Brennan Center did a study. We have a computer with 1 billion voter records in it. It's an actual computer. I found out it's not on the cloud. It's in a room in our office with good air conditioning. We believe it is the best and biggest voter record there is. And what it found was that
Give to the Brennan Center so they can update their computer technology.
Yeah. The floppy disks are quality of
Oh my God.
Quality of life. The racial turnout gap, the gap between participation rates by white voters and non-white voters, has grown all over the country over the past decade. There are many reasons why that could be, and if you think about it, not all states have bad voting laws. So there are social, political, cultural reasons. But in the states that used to be covered by the Strong Voting Rights Act before it was gutted by the Supreme Court, that gap has grown at twice the rate of the rest of the country. So all of these laws combine to create obstacles, especially for younger voters who are lower propensity, who might not have the habit and the tradition of voting. But it's not, you're right as well, it's not just the specific like voter ID law or moving a polling place, it's to sow doubt in the veracity and legitimacy of the elections. As we've said, this myth is being pushed right now about non-citizen voting. You hear it from Donald Trump in the debates or on the debate stage. We will hear it next week from J.D. Vance when he debates. It is an urban myth. It is not true. Only citizens vote in the United States. It is illegal already 4 times over. Everybody agrees to this. Why push it? Because it sows doubt. It sows doubt, and why is it important to sow doubt if it doesn't necessarily have a legal consequence? Because it sets the stage for people challenging the legitimacy of the election when it actually happens. And that, again, I do think that's a new thing in our country. At least we haven't had something like that in a long time.
Yeah, and these tactics, I mean, you need to understand like the practical consequences and things that, again, would not have been allowed before the Shelby County decision. Justice Department would have opposed them. I mean, at last number I saw, like there were at least about 1,700 polling places that were closed after the Shelby County decision, disproportionately in communities of color. Voter purge attempts happen disproportionately in communities of color or where they are perceived to be Democrats, grouped. And polling places, that has an impact. You see these long lines. You wonder, well, why are they long? I live in Washington, D.C., upper Northwest. It takes me, 10 minutes to vote, 7 minutes to vote, shaking hands with people. I could probably do it in 3 minutes if I just walked in and out. And yet, you see these long lines in a lot of places. Now, some of it is the intensity. People are engaged and all that stuff. But you also see these long lines with long lines of black folks, for instance, in Georgia, in Atlanta. Well, what's that all about? Well, and then you see, well, that also, then you think to yourself, well, wait, why does Georgia pass this law that says you can't give anybody food or water if they're waiting in line to vote? Well, what do you need that for? Well, how about this? You close the polls, you create the long lines, you can't give people water, you can't give them food, and the hope is that some people are simply going to say, well, I can't stay in this line because I got to get a job, so go get to my job, or I'm thirsty, I'm hungry, whatever, and they'll leave the line. And our elections are very close, and so if 2-3% of the people leave the lines, that is potentially election determinative. And so there's a method to the stuff that seems kind of wacky, but actually is designed to have an electoral impact. And so these are the kinds of things that we have been bringing, lawsuits against. And you should understand, I'm the Democrat who's up here. He works for a nonpartisan organization, and so I just want to make sure that everything that I say should not ascribe to him. He's the neutral in this whole fight. But I have to say that the Brennan Center, through their examination of facts, has been one of the things that has helped us in the lawsuits that we have brought when we're just, again, using the facts to make, to buttress the arguments that we are indeed making. Another tangible example. 2020 presidential election, Atlanta, Georgia, after 5 o'clock. Black part of Atlanta, white part of Atlanta. Takes you about 6 minutes to actually go into the white part of Atlanta, cast a vote for president and leave. 52 minutes in the black part of Atlanta. Now, same election, same day, after 5 o'clock, 2020 election. Again, you see, lack of polling places, closed by, the kind of heroes now, Brad Raffensperger and Brian Kemp, they did the right thing with regard to Trump and some of the stuff, but they're also pretty good voter suppressors. And these things, again, seem to have, what's the deal? 52 minutes as opposed to 6 minutes. Same election after 5 o'clock, same city.
Same city. So I want to stick a little bit with the confusion theme here, General Holder. Could you talk a little bit about the Supreme Court's emergency order in an Arizona case on the so-called shadow docket this summer? Like, what's that case about, and why is it not going away?
Yeah, why don't the shadow docket go away? The shadow docket is the part, Supreme Court essentially makes substantive rulings without hearing oral argument, without briefs, but nevertheless makes law through these things on what's called the shadow docket. In Arizona, that case really is kind of a confusing thing because you had the court going into three different directions. And the question was whether or not people, what did you need to have in order to vote in both a federal election as well as a state election? Different forms. The Arizona legislature decided that you should have, if you wanted to actually vote in a state election, you needed to have proof that you were in fact an American citizen. You couldn't just swear to the fact that you were or be worried about the criminal penalties that would be involved. There's a federal law that says that's, basically all you got to do, swear to it, and, there's a basis for it. You can vote in a federal election. And so what happened is you end up with a bifurcated system there, where if you don't have sufficient proof, you can vote for president, but you might not, and Senate, federal election, but you might not be able to vote for who's the governor or who's in the state legislature. I mean, what kind of, that doesn't make an awful lot of sense. The Supreme Court looks at this whole thing and essentially decides that that's like okay, kind of, but does it really close to the election. This is the decision that came out in the court, I think, in August. And then the Arizona Supreme Court does something that makes the decision of the United States Supreme Court maybe not quite as bad, but done by the shadow docket, done very close to the election, which violates this thing called the Purcell Doctrine. I think we're going to talk about that. And this is the kind of thing where the Supreme Court, this iteration of the United States Supreme Court, uses a lot of the principles, Purcell Doctrine. Sometimes, they'll do things right up very close to an election, or they'll use the Purcell Doctrine to say, well, we can't change something that they ideologically agree with and that I would say is anti-democracy. And so I think we're going to be faced with I'm concerned about the direction of this Supreme Court when it comes down to some ultimate questions that they might have to deal with.
There are going to be questions, I think, in front of the Supreme Court. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, and one of the things that happened in 2020 is, as you might remember, 63 courts ruled against Donald Trump's claim that the election had been stolen. And contrary to what he said the other day in the debate, this was not just on standing on the idea that you couldn't bring the case. Many of them looked at the substance and said there was no substance, no truth to the charges. And the Supreme Court, even this very conservative Supreme Court, stayed out. The state of Texas sued the state of Pennsylvania, claiming Pennsylvania had not done the right thing in the way it enforced its own voting laws, and the Supreme Court said, forget it, that we're never going to hear that case. I worry, we certainly have our eyes on this Supreme Court right now, because in recent years, and especially in this immunity decision that the Attorney General referred to, Trump versus United States, this court has been, up until now, a conservative court. It has been a Federalist Society court, arguably a Republican court. It has not been a MAGA court. They have not gone out of their way until lately to bail Donald Trump out of legal accountability for his conduct and misdeeds when appropriate. And so this court has a very different vibe right now than it did in 2020. And we certainly, I wouldn't expect that the Supreme Court is going to decide the election, but I think it's a good thing to keep the cases away from them as much as possible as well. And look, the results of the election, in one way or another, we don't know who's going to win. It may not actually be so close that things are decided by a few votes here or there and a legal ruling. But it's a highly politicized moment at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always this optimistic guy, always thinks that things will go according to the rules and the regulations, and, the folks, my lovely folks at NDRC was kind of like bringing me back to Eric. No. After the immunity decision, I mean, that decision itself was, they just pulled that out of the air. Out of the air. Out of the air. They actually pulled
This
it
will
out.
be edited, right?
Yeah, they actually pulled it out of someplace else. But anyway, they pulled it out of the air. And that really gives me pause. I thought there were certain lines that this court might not cross. To come up with that, which I think is an ideological decision, not necessarily a partisan one, but an ideological decision, gives me concern about what might happen if there's another round of challenges to the very legitimate voting that I think will go on.
So since you mentioned the Purcell principle, let's talk about the Purcell principle, because it basically is a tradition on the Supreme Court that you can't change any of the election rules close to the election. But as you just mentioned, in Arizona, of course, states don't really abide by the Purcell principle. So, and as it happens also, the Supreme Court does not does not abide by the Purcell principle. Rick Hassan wrote a piece for Slate last week, sounding the alarm on these last-minute changes. Are you alarmed?
Yeah, I'm really worried about some of this stuff. I mean, the things in Georgia, hand counting stuff. I mean, again, they're just making this stuff up. Why do we have to have hand counts? I mean, what is that all about? You know, because they're concerned that machines are being manipulated by, I don't know, what was it for? Venezuela, Italians, I don't know, something, you know, where some foreign country, you know, or some aliens were somehow messing around with the systems. You probably view that with your system as bad as it, as old as it is. But I mean, no, but I mean, you know, we have state-of-the-art technology that is just fine and that counts votes in a better way than human beings do. And yet they're tinkering with that. They're trying to do some things in Oklahoma. I mean, and they're talking about doing these things like now. You know, where people have already started voting. You know, there's early voting going on in a number of states. And the Purcell principle is that, you know, you stop, I don't know, 6 months, 9 months, a year before, and you don't do anything that brings uncertainty into the process. And I'm really worried about what will happen, what's going on now, but what will happen even like the day before the election, the week before the election. Will they be so bold as to come up with yet another way in which you can either sow doubt or have an impact, an actual impact on what the vote is, what the count is, who gets to vote? You know, there's a whole range of things that in some ways to me are unimaginable, but are nevertheless real.
Yeah, I mean, in Georgia, they're really letting their freak flag fly. There is a newly...
I like that, letting their freak flag fly.
The state election board now has a majority of 3 members whom Donald Trump praised by name at a rally as warriors for victory. And they said, oh, we're going to start counting the number of ballots by hand. They started doing a whole bunch of other things of that nature. In other words, the states didn't get the memo on the Purcell doctrine. There's some logic to the idea that you don't want to change things at the last minute, but it needs to be fairly and uniformly applied. In Nebraska, in recent days, there was an attempt to change how that state counts its electoral votes. Nebraska and Maine are the 2 states that do not award the electoral votes by the majority of the vote in the state. Each congressional district gets a different vote. And I think that's a bad idea, but anyway, that's how they do it. Maine always said if Nebraska changes its system, we're going to change ours too. They had a 90-day deadline. The next day, Nebraska tried to change its electoral system so that the whole state would vote by popular vote, which could turn out to be the decisive electoral vote in a close election. One state senator actually stopped it, and the governor there, a Republican, has announced that it's not going to happen. But I think we're going to see increasingly frenetic and increasingly creative methods being attempted between here and the election. We kind of look at it with fascination. It's entirely illegitimate. And I think it's important that even those of us who work on this, but certainly everybody, not lose the sense of outrage at the idea that you change the rules just before the game. This is not how a democracy works. And part of what stops it from happening is the sense that it's unfair. So, ultimately, I'm less worried about the run-up to the election at this point. One thing that has changed since 2020 is the election officials are much more ready now. They're facing threats of violence, they're facing harassment, but law enforcement has stepped up, for example, to help. In every state in the country, the Brennan Center has worked with others to create an organization called the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections. It's half election officials and half law enforcement. And in every state in the country now, beat cops, police officers, will be carrying a pocket guide of how to protect voting rights on Election Day, because that's what you have to do, unfortunately, when there are these threats. I'm less worried about the run-up to Election Day and more worried about what happens after, when people try to discredit the results, even when they're fair.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I don't think I think Michael raises a good point about Nebraska. We got to look at what happened there. You know, I mean, this has been the way it's been for a long period of time. You agree with it or not agree with it, that's kind of the way Nebraska awards its electoral votes. All of a sudden, Lindsey Graham, who is a senator from not Nebraska but South Carolina, is out in Nebraska saying, you all need to change your system here. And here's the deal. All right, so it's one electoral vote. Well, what's the thing? Well, here's the thing. if Kamala Harris were to win Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, but lose the other battleground states, and if Nebraska's vote goes the way Lindsey Graham wanted it to go and inconsistent with the way it has been done, you'd end up with 269 electoral votes for Kamala Harris, 269 electoral votes for Donald Trump. You'd end up with a tie. And then how is it decided? Well, the United States House of Representatives votes for the president. But you don't vote, all of the members of the House don't vote, you vote by state delegation. Every state has one vote. And there would undoubtedly be more Republican-controlled state delegations, and Trump would win the election. So that's why that one vote really, really matters. Now, the interesting other thing about that is that the Senate would then pick the vice president. So, you know, if the Democrats somehow held on to the Senate, you could end up with President Trump and maybe, I don't know, Tim Walz as vice president. There's all kinds of bizarre stuff. But anyway, I mean, the fact is that they're tinkering with the system, you know, as I said before, as people are voting and doing it in a way that's inconsistent with the practice of Nebraska for, you know, a long, long period of time. If they want to change it, do it after the election, you know, and if you want to do it for the next election, all right, that's fine, you got that right. But to tinker with it and to see how, you know, diabolical it is. I mean, Lindsey Graham, you know, I mean, this guy's from South Carolina. He's out campaigning for this in Nebraska. Like, take your ass back to South Carolina. What are you doing, man, you know?
Well, speaking of the Electoral College, isn't that maybe the biggest threat to American democracy, is the fact that we have this kind of system?
It's certainly among the largest. I mean, you know, if you run for class president in the third grade, if you run for co-op president, president of the PTA, president of the student association at Columbia, you know, law school, Columbia College, Senate here at Columbia, Student Senate, you get the most votes, you win. Hey, that makes sense. Only in the United States, you know, of all the industrialized nations and, you know, serious democracies, only in the United States do you have a system where you can get the most popular support and lose an election, you know? And so, yeah, that is a significant problem, especially when one looks at the history of the Electoral College and how it's rooted in slavery and the distrust that the founding fathers had in the people to make appropriate decisions. And as Michael said, 7 out of 8?
Yep.
7 out of 8 of the last elections, Democrats have gotten more, you know, more of the popular vote, more votes than Republicans have for president, but nevertheless did not win the presidency, you know, all the time. And so that is something that, and here's the other thing. If you were really concerned about being anti-fraud, you would not support the Electoral College. The reality is to try to steal an election when you're counting all the votes, you know, from this vast nation, it'd be hard to come up with a viable fraud or even a fraud theory to say that you stole an election when, like, you know, Hillary Clinton won by close to 3 million votes, Joe Biden won by 7 million votes. I mean, how could you do that? On the other hand, if it's just a state and, you know, Al Gore loses Florida, supposedly, by 535 votes or something like that, you can see if you can tinker with one state, you can have an impact on the outcome of an election, which tends to lead to conspiracy theories and the possibility of fraud having an impact on an election. If you've got it so that you're just counting the popular vote, those theories have less weight, and I think makes our electoral system more fair and more consistent with the desires of the people.
And I will say, it's important for those of you who are in school now to understand, this is new. When I was here at Columbia, the Electoral College was for aficionados. Everybody assumed the winner of the popular vote, you vote for president, you're choosing the president. The Electoral College followed the popular vote in every election from 1882 to 1996. But in this century, twice the popular vote loser became president, and it almost happened 2 other times. I mean, arguably, it almost happened in 2020. In 2004, John Kerry, if a few thousand votes in Ohio had gone differently, Democrat John Kerry would have been elected president, even though George W. Bush, the incumbent Republican, handily won the popular vote. So it's important that this, even though certainly this seems normal to you, people didn't even know what red states and blue states were in 2000. This is a real example, unfortunately, of backsliding and acceptance and learned helplessness about some of the undemocratic aspects of our democracy.
Yeah, I mean, the Electoral College has got to go. I mean, full stop. There's, I don't think, any justification for it. And the dangers that it poses for our democracy, I don't think can be understated. It is really something that, as Michael was saying, no one ever really kind of thought about this. It's like, yeah, popular vote. What was the margin? That was Walter Cronkite. I know you all know Walter Cronkite. He would come out and say, Richard Nixon won the election by 10 million votes. Ronald Reagan won the election by 10 million. Whatever. And then you thought, all right, that was the election. But actually, it wasn't. It was not until they met and the Electoral College actually cast their votes that the election of the president was confirmed. But it was an afterthought then. Now it's real, and electoral strategies are based on winning states as opposed to coming up with policies and proposals that will win the national vote. It balkanizes us.
Right. Well, speaking of these strategies, this question is for you, Michael. Let's look ahead to what's coming, because the GOP, as you already touched on, is really making a decision to set aside their ground game in favor of a litigation game, right? That instead of focusing on getting out the vote, they are focusing on poll watchers, and in many states, these poll watchers today are now on the inside. They used to be on the outside shouting at the people on the inside, and now they're on the inside where the counting happens. So what are your chief concerns? Which places or which mechanisms are you watching most closely in these last 40 days?
So it's a little hard to fully sort out what's going on, to separate the kind of hype from the facts. It is the case that every 2 years there are people who say, oh, there's massive voter fraud and we're going to stop it. And there are private organizations like True the Vote and others who say we're going to mobilize 1 million vigilantes to go to the polls and stop all the voter fraud, and then 12 people show up. They've raised their money, but nothing happens. And so it's always a risk of over crediting their claims. Having said that, it is the case, apparently, that in this election, Donald Trump and his campaign did not mount a get-out-the-vote operation. They've outsourced that to third-party groups like Turning Point USA, and they are instead focusing on, quote, election integrity. Poll watchers, not get-out-the-vote mobilizers. Many of those partisans are working in the election system, are working as poll workers and other things. We all rely, it turns out, on election officials and election volunteers who, whatever their partisan background, get the idea that you're supposed to be neutral and just run the election fair and square. Among the types of issues that we are all worried about is certification. Our system turns out we don't have one national election, we don't even have 50 state elections. There are hundreds and hundreds of county elections, and all these little checkpoints along the way where it turns out people can try to make trouble. The certification of elections. You're now starting to see in Georgia and in Nevada and other places, people saying, well, I'm not going to certify the results because I think there might be fraud and we're going to have to do some investigations. Certification is one of these things that, in legal terms, is called ministerial. It's supposed to really be 2 + 2 = 4. That's the answer. It's illegal what they want to do. So we're worried about it. But if enough people kind of hold the line and say this is the normal, legal, constitutionally mandated way to run an election, I think we should be okay. But it's going to require a lot of effort on all of our part to make sure that the disruption doesn't happen.
Well, as a Democrat, I'm really happy that they're devoting their time and resources to that kind of stuff, as opposed to people knocking on doors and trying to get people to the polls. Because at the end of the day, it's a much more efficacious use of your time and money to actually interact with voters, convince them that they need to vote, and then vote for your party. So that's there's a danger, but in terms of voting and who's gonna vote where, how. Let them do what they're doing. That's fine.
Yes, we should definitely get out the vote. That would be the easiest way. So, General Holder, I have a follow-up question. It's almost the same one that I just asked Michael, and it's tweaked a little bit because state courts clearly are going to be really pivotal. And in your mind, what states are the most vulnerable right now for the election results to be challenged?
Well, I'd simply say the battleground states. Those are the places because of the Electoral College. Those, I guess, 7 states are the ones that are give me the greatest concern, and because of no concern about the Purcell principle, not doing anything too close to an election, who knows what'll happen in just pick a state. I don't know, Arizona, Georgia, some other state, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, where people might just try to do something. And you got to give them credit. They are creative. They come up with some wild stuff. Aliens, not aliens. I guess they haven't gone that far. But, people trucked in from Mexico to come and vote. I mean, these are all the kinds of things that, that they've talked about.
In Arizona, they had an audit after the last election because they said that what they were looking for was they were looking at the ballot paper to look for bamboo fibers because that would prove they'd been printed in China with all these votes for Joe Biden. And guess what? They didn't find the bamboo fibers. But even if they had, there's a level of kind of getting high on your own supply here where they're spinning wilder and wilder conspiracies and fantasies, and it's guiding conduct.
Yeah, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, think about that. There's an element of racism there, but let's not deal with that. But I mean, we're gonna look for bamboo in the ballots. Like what? And then, nevertheless, they do their audit, which shows that the election was held credibly, legitimately, appropriately in Arizona. And what do? They dismiss that. It's like, well, wait a minute. You guys called for this audit unnecessarily. You lose the audit. And then they dismiss the audit itself. It's kind of like, they only agree with something if they win. If you don't win, it had to be fraud.
Yes. Well, these are the times. So, Michael, now that we've discussed here at length that even though Kamala Harris might win decisively in the popular vote, she's still looking to potentially lose the Electoral College. So when you wake up in a cold sweat about that, if you do, what do you tell yourself? Or what do you do the next day when you wake up?
I think that the most important thing right now, the thing that gives me hope, is the rise of the election deniers has been unnerving. It has been threatening. It's been the story in some ways of the last few years in our democracy. What's new, what's different, and what's encouraging is there is now a democracy movement that has grown up, at least in part, in response, that is wider, deeper, more energized, and more diverse than any I've seen, and I've been working on this for many, many years. And it's not only fighting bad stuff. It's not only fighting against voter suppression or whatever. First of all, moving and winning in the court of public opinion is really important, but not just that. Pushing for reforms, for bold legislative change that can mean we don't have to have these fights over and over again, that would improve our democracy, that would restore the power of the Voting Rights Act and other things. One of the things that happened this past few months, there's a trope, as you're familiar in the media sometimes. People say, Vice President Harris, she's run an amazing campaign, but she's really light on the specifics. She's not specific enough in her policies. Well, on this, she has been bold and specific. There's legislation that the Attorney General and many others have worked on called the Freedom to Vote Act. It is sweeping pro-democracy legislation. It would set national standards on early voting, automatic voter registration, other things like that. It would ban gerrymandering nationwide so that it applies fairly in whatever state it is. It addresses dark money in politics. And the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act companion legislation which would restore the strength of the Voting Rights Act after the wrecking ball of the Supreme Court. These bills passed the House and had a majority of the Senate in the last Congress, but 2 senators would not change the filibuster rules so they could pass. Those senators are going to be gone. Senator Schumer in Chicago, the week of the Democratic convention at an event that we held, said these would be the first bills brought up in the new Congress if they have the power, and they would change the filibuster rules. And the next day, Vice President Harris, in her acceptance speech, said she would sign them into law. So there is a real chance, depending on what the political alignment is, for really generational progress on this. So what gives me hope is that chance to actually make big positive change if we all raise our voices loud enough.
Right, but now that means we got to win the presidency. I'm Democrat, so we have to win the presidency, the House, and the Senate. House, I think, looks pretty good. I think, presidency looks pretty good. Senate's going to be tough, but I think is doable. But if that happens, that carve-out of the filibuster to allow the passage of these 2 bills just has to happen. I mean, what Michael didn't say is there were 2 senators who didn't agree to change the filibuster rule. Those were 2 Democratic senators, Senators Manchin and Sinema. But they're gone, and I miss them. Yeah. But they'll be, if we retain the Senate, it will not be with Manchin, without Sinema. And I have it on good information that the candidates who are reconstituted Democratic Senate majority, or even just a tie, Democratic tie, 50-50, that's fine, because if we win the presidency, Vice President breaks the ties, that they're all committed to, the changes that Michael was just talking about. And those are transformational.
Generational, decades and decades. And they're very popular pieces of legislation as well. I mean, there's a real national consensus. Right. And you might say, oh, gee whiz, isn't it terrible to have this be one party? These would be passing, in all likelihood on a party line vote. The last time the Voting Rights Act came before Congress for reauthorization was in 2006. It passed the Senate 98-0. President George W. Bush proudly signed the legislation with John Lewis himself standing next to him. These issues have been bipartisan. They should be bipartisan, but what's most important is we need to stand up for democracy. And so that's one of the possible outcomes.
Right.
Yes, here's hoping. So, General Holder, given the Supreme Court's immunity decision, which was shocking to us all, and of course the subsequent reporting by the New York Times about the Chief Justice's hand in all of this, and also the way that they decided the last 3 insurrection cases in the High Court, do you have any hope or any optimism, I should say, do you have any optimism about how this court might rule on any election cases?
I guess I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, you're really tinkering with some fundamental things in our democracy if you go in the tank on a case that might come up, like those 63 cases that were brought before and, pretty much dismissed in state courts or in wherever they were brought, and the United States Supreme Court stayed out of it. On the other hand, I'm old enough to remember Bush versus Gore, where the Supreme Court essentially decided and the election there. So yeah, I'm worried, but I think that means we've got to go out and do the work. As Michael was saying before, we need to have margins such that, not 535 votes in Florida. I mean, we need to have, thousands, hundreds of thousands of, differences between hopefully the winning candidate, my candidate, Kamala Harris, and, and Donald Trump. And so that means, doing the work.
And there was another case, you mentioned the Merrill v. Milligan case. There was another recent major case in front of the Supreme Court called Moore versus Harper. Now, they should never have heard this case in the first place. That's important to remember. But this was the legal theory of the election deniers. It was how they dressed up their power grab in constitutional garb. And it was something they called the, quote, independent state legislature theory. Calling it a theory is very generous. It was the idea that state legislatures had the exclusive power to set election rules with no checks and balances from state constitutions, state courts, governors signing or vetoing a bill, or voters, and that nobody had ever noticed it before in the previous 200 plus years of the Constitution. The court took the case. It was really threatening. Former Judge Michael Ludig, a prominent conservative, said he thought it was the most important case on democracy, maybe in the country's history. An attempt, he said, to steal the election. There was a real outcry from liberal and conservatives saying, no, this is not the way we do it. And in the end, it was a 6-3 decision rejecting this crackpot idea. I won't call it a theory. Sometimes the Supreme Court always, in the past anyway, has been very attentive to public opinion, to the political currents, to its own legitimacy. And right now, this Supreme Court has squandered its legitimacy. Public trust in the Supreme Court, in all public opinion polls, has plummeted to the lowest level ever recorded. Some of that is decisions like the Dobbs case, some of that is the scandals that we keep hearing about. But the idea that more and more people have is that it's just a political body, that they're not really acting like a court. And so I think, again, the court of public opinion will matter enormously in saving our democracy from the court of people in those robes.
Yeah, I mean, really quickly, the independent state legislature case, again, was brought by the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Judge Ludig was co-counsel in that case with Neil Katyal, former acting Solicitor General. The three justices who voted in the minority there should be ashamed of themselves. I mean, that case, again, we're talking about pulling stuff out of the whatever. I mean, that theory was as crackpot as it ever could have been. And the fact that that got 3 votes, 3 votes. I mean, the fact that we won the case was great and we should have won, but that should have been a 9-zip. I mean, that was clearly, but you had 3 justices. And if that's the core, that means you got to find 2 other ones who might go along with something that comes before the court. And you could end up with a really, I think, traumatic and bad result for our democracy.
Well, on that note, normally I ask my guests on the podcast what makes them hopeful. So I'm going to stand this question on its head because hope doesn't vote, right? And you can't hope voter suppression out of existence, and it also seems you can't even vote it out of existence, and you can't even sue it out of existence. So what are we supposed to do? Einstein famously said that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So if we could step out of our current mindset, how could we do this totally differently?
So the Brennan Center is named after Justice William Brennan, the great liberal Supreme Court justice of the Warren Court era. And so it might be a surprise for me to say, I do not think that our democracy is going to get saved in the courts. It is not going to get saved even by the best litigation. Only, broadly speaking, mobilizing public sentiment and public political action will advance our democracy, and that is actually the way it has always been throughout our country's history. There's a quote, I write books, and one of the things is almost every, I think that Einstein quote is a real quote. Einstein never said, however, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and getting a different result. It turns out most of the famous quotes by dead people are made up. But this is a real quote from Abraham Lincoln. It sounds so contemporary, but he said it in the first Lincoln-Douglas debate. And he was talking about slavery and the expansion of slavery. He said, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, anything is possible. Without public sentiment, nothing is possible. Consequently, those who mold public sentiment have greater power than legislators or judges. He was right, and that's a lesson for all of us now. If there's a mobilized public demanding a real democracy, then I'm not really ultimately worried.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I did a tweet. Sophia helped me put that together. And I don't know. It's one that I did that got. I'm sorry, I did an X, not a tweet, right? Whatever it is, I don't know, whatever it is, and it got like 2.5 million something or others, and it said, "There are no saviors, there are no miracles. That ultimately there's no cavalry coming. That we are the cavalry, each and every one of us. And the question is not what's going to happen. The question is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do?" Everybody here needs to be voting. Everybody here needs to be working to get other people to vote, trying to figure out ways in which you can have an impact. This is a blue state, and so things will probably be fine in New York, but there are ways that we have in our organization called allontheline.org where you can have an impact, virtually, electronically in some other state, a battleground state. But we are the ones who have to put in the work, because we are the cavalry, we are the ones who will control this. And that notion of a focused, committed American people always wins, always wins. When I was here at Columbia and protesting against the war, the Vietnam War, not World War I, the war, that war didn't end because we had reached our military objectives or even because we were militarily defeated. It ended because the American people, or sufficient numbers of the American people, said, don't want to do this anymore, And so when it comes to matters of war and peace, elections and protection of our democracy, we still have the power. We still have the power, and we should never, ever forget that. I've had a number of titles in my career. I have the one that I'm most proud of now, American citizen. American citizen. But with that title comes responsibilities. And I don't think that we should shirk that responsibility that we have, and we should be engaged in the protection of the enhancement of our democracy. If we do that, we'll end up, okay. It's not going to be easy, and we will suffer defeats along the way. Progress doesn't go in a linear fashion. But if we're engaged, if we're involved, we'll win. We'll win.
Thank you. Well, I have only one last question. It's been so interesting and so edifying to listen to you both in this time. And as I was listening to you, I was wondering, who do you listen to? What do you read? How do you make sense of these times? Who do you turn to?
I listen to great podcasts.
Thank you.
Is that the right answer?
That's the right answer.
I actually listen to a lot of history podcasts. I think that when you look back, so many things were so tumultuous in so many ways in the past. It actually gives me comfort and also an instruction manual on how to make progress.
Yeah, I think that's right. Being conversant with our history is something that I think is important because, we always think, oh, it's never been this bad before. Well, actually, we fought a civil war. That was kind of bad. And 1968, unbelievably bad year, assassinations, a whole range of things. If you're conversant with history, as I try to be, that kind of gives me hope. But also, one of the things I do is I like to follow what Republicans are saying, both sane and otherwise. And, when I hear, Charlie Sykes, David Jolly, Michael Steele, I'm just trying to think of, some Republicans, they give me hope that this party that I think is necessary. I think it's good to have a strong conservative party, not the wild-ass thing that we have now, but a strong, conversant, moored, ideologically moored and factually moored party. Gives me hope that we'll get past this Trump era and get back to having, this is a loud nation. We yell at each other, and that's fine, but let's do it like we used to do it, where it was about not the facts, but about the policies. We kind of agreed on the facts, largely, but let's talk about the policies, and I think we can get back to that. And so being conversant with history and having faith that these sane Republicans are going to retake their party or create a new one, that will ultimately, I think, get to that good place.
Thank you. Thank you both for joining us tonight, and thank you all to the audience. I think we have time for 2 questions. Right here in the front.
Well, now we need questions, not statements. Okay.
Here, let me give you the microphone.
Good evening, General Holder. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. My question for you is, my name is Om Desai. I'm a first-year student studying political science at Columbia. My question for you is this. We've recently seen an epidemic of political polarization, and obviously people just can't have a conversation anymore. You run this voting rights initiative at NRDC. How do you think we can use voting rights to combat political polarization and restore faith in the democratic process? Because people really need to feel like they have a stake in the country in order to be empowered and be respectful towards each other.
Yeah, I think that if we have elections that are fair and that are considered fair, which is what I've tried to work for, and if people feel invested, in the result of an election or our governmental system because they've had the ability to participate in a fair way and the election was conducted in a fair way, I think that has the ability to, stop the polarization. But here's the other thing. We're not as polarized as people say we are. Our political class is very polarized. But on the big issues around this country, whether it's reproductive rights, climate, voter protection, criminal justice reform, this nation is basically, the people are basically in the same place. But again, because of gerrymandering, we don't get sane gun laws, for instance, that are supporting background checks. That polls at like 70, 80% with regard to, the American people. I was talking about very early on, the protections of Roe versus Wade. Again, overwhelming majority of the American people are there. But our political class is really divided. And so I think we should not fall into that trap and think that we are as divided as people say. Now, the ones, there's a lot of loud, I said we're loud, but in some of the loudest people are the ones who are the most divisive. And so we should not, and that makes good for good television and good quotes in newspapers. But a lot of these people are whack jobs without much, it's a technical term, without much support. But I think, as I said, a fair system will promote, I think, greater amounts of unity. But we're also not as polarized as I think we say our political class is, and that is, I think, a function of the inadequacies and the way in which our elections have been manipulated. Our electoral system has been manipulated.
One more question right here.
Hi, my name is Christopher. I'm a senior at Columbia College. I have a question about independent redistricting commissions, and it's for both Attorney General Holder and Mr. Walden. So last I checked, I believe there's 9 independent congressional redistricting commissions. And given your support for those commissions, how optimistic are you that they can become a nationwide practice, and what would your strategy be to do so?
Well, the most effective way to have redistricting reform nationwide is national legislation, because that applies to all states. And the lesson over and over is that if you don't have either the Supreme Court or the Congress stepping up to enforce national rights, states will abuse the rights of their people. The strategy works best in this case in states that have direct democracy. New York is not really one of them, but in other words, where there are ballot initiatives. And so in Michigan, for example, a really strong redistricting commission was passed. I believe the one in Ohio will win, California, Arizona. There's room for more and more progress there. But ultimately, federal legislation, the bill I mentioned, the Freedom to Vote Act, originally had a requirement for redistricting commissions in every state. It no longer does, but it still has very strong standards that would have a positive impact all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, Michael's point is a really good one and an important one. We've been able to get these commissions in states where you have the ability to have the people decide through ballot initiatives. Every time we have put before the people, red state or blue state, do you think that the state legislature should be drawing these lines, or would you rather have a disinterested, independent commission drawing the lines? The commission wins. I mean, Utah, Missouri, very red states. But you don't have the ability to have ballot initiatives in every state. It depends on the state constitution. And so I think there are only 16 states, maybe something like that, where you can actually pull that off. We can actually do ballot initiatives. And so every place that we can, we have tried to do that, because I think that is actually the gold standard, to have these independent commissions as opposed to interested state legislators drawing the lines.
And effective citizen movements can even get legislatures to pass things like this. New York State is now implementing a very strong campaign finance reform law, the most effective response to Citizens United since that misguided Supreme Court ruling, and it was done without a ballot initiative. So again, a mobilized citizen movement can make surprising progress sometimes.
Okay, so I guess we end here. Well, let me just say thank you so much to our great moderator, wonderful, thought-provoking questions. And the name of the podcast is?
Future Hindsight. Listen every Thursday. Future Hindsight.
There you go. And Mr. Waldman is a true American patriot who has run the Brennan Center in just an exemplary way, cognizant of the fact that it's a nonpartisan organization, but not afraid to identify what the facts are and to push those facts out at the risk of being called a partisan or to be criticized. It is a great organization, and this is a great man. So thanks very much for being here with us.
And we're honored to be with you.
And I would say to all of you, I graduated from Columbia a little before you all did, before even your fathers and mothers were born, probably, you know. But you all are the best and the brightest. You really are. You are the leaders, the future leaders of this country. And it is incumbent upon you to lead this nation in a way that's consistent with that which is best about Columbia, and I think which is best about this nation. We need a pluralistic system. We need a fair system where everybody is heard. And I think we can do that. I always say these things at these events. You know, Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But guess what? It doesn't bend on its own. It only bends when people like you all put your hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And so the question is that you need to ask yourselves, what am I doing? Ask yourself, what am I doing to pull that arc towards justice? That is the responsibility that you all have as American citizens. It's especially the responsibility that you all have as being the leaders of your generation and the leaders, I think, of this nation. And don't think that your youth somehow disqualifies you from leadership positions. Every major social movement in this country has been led by young people. Young people. The founding of this nation, young people. The only old founding father was Benjamin Franklin. Everybody else is pretty young. You know, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence like in his 30s. Women's suffrage, young people. Civil rights movement, Dr. King, John Lewis, Diane Nash, young people. So don't think that because you're young, you got to wait your time. No. You all be engaged, you all be involved, you all change this nation. You're Columbia students. That's what we expect of you. That's what I hope that I will see from this next generation. And that, at the end of the day, is the thing that keeps me optimistic. You all. So get out there and change the world.
Thank you so much for those inspiring words, and thank you so much to our amazing Columbia College alumni who are really in the trenches protecting our democracy. We're so grateful for everything you do and all of your support of us here. And to piggyback on what General Holder said about throwing the baton to you, the young people, I would like to invite a young person to the stage. Her name is Hannah Bloomquist. She's the president of Columbia Votes, and she's just going to talk briefly about the ways in which you can get involved leading up to the election here on campus.
Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Bloomquist. I am a senior at Barnard and a first year at SEPA. Thank you all so much for truly such a wonderful discussion. As Beth mentioned, I am the president of Columbia Votes. We are Columbia's nonpartisan student-led voting initiative here at Columbia. And what that means is that our mission is to ensure that every single member of the Columbia community not only is registered to vote, but is also equipped with the tools and well-informed in order to do so. So if you are sitting in the audience here today and you are feeling particularly inclined to register or to request a ballot, particularly after General Holder's galvanizing remarks at the end, we invite you to do so. Columbia Votes will be at the table in the back, so please come find us. We will help you register. We will help you request a ballot. And if you're ready to join the fight with us as well, please email columbiavotes@columbia.edu. Thank you all so much, and we hope that you will stay to join us for the reception afterward.